When I saw the paw prints mingled with the scattered children's toys across the dusty floor of that long-abandoned house, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew this was no accident. When I saw the paw prints mingled with the scattered children's toys across the dusty floor of that long-abandoned house, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew this was no accident. I arrived at the edge of the overgrown clearing just as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting elongated shadows over the twisting path. Rumor had it that someone had seen a lone fox cub wandering these woods, abandoned and starving. I'd spent decades as a forest ranger, and even in retirement, I couldn't ignore a call like this. I parked my old pickup beneath a crooked birch and grabbed my flashlight and field jacket. The air smelled of moss and damp earth, and every rustle in the underbrush set my pulse racing. The trail led me to what used to be a cluster of small cottages, once a thriving homestead before it was claimed by time and neglect. Roof beams sagged, windows gaped like empty eyes, and vines strangled the walls. I hesitated at the threshold of the largest structure, the one that looked most intact. Something about it felt alive. Inside, debris carpeted the floor, rotting floorboards, broken shutters, the remnants of forgotten lives. My beam caught on a line of tiny footprints, 4 oval pads, a central pad, the signature of Canine Gait. Then, a second set, the diminutive outline of bare human feet. My heart thumped so loudly I worried it would echo across the silent hall. Half the footprints were wolf prints, pressed deep into the dust as though the creature had lumbered cautiously through. The other half were those of a child, small, bare, surprisingly tender impressions. I froze. If a wolf was here, it could be just around the corner. My hand drifted to the flashlight, my mind racing through safety protocols drilled into me over years in the wild. Then I heard it, a soft, steady inhalation, childlike, innocent, utterly human. It was the sound of a small girl breathing, not a growl or a snarl. My whole body tensed. I'd come expecting an animal scrapbook. Rescuer saves cub, happy ending. Instead, I felt I'd stumbled into a story far stranger. I edged forward, every nerve on fire. Through the jagged doorway where a section of the wall had collapsed, I caught sight of them. Huddled together in a pool of fading afternoon light sat a little girl and a wolf. The girl wore a tattered dress, dirt caking her ankles, her dark hair tangled in knots. She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her expression unreadable. Beside her lay the wolf, its fur matted, ribs faintly visible, but its stance was calm, almost deferential. Its golden eyes held mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, voice thick with disbelief. "Hey there, are you okay?" My words sounded brittle in the hush. The girl said nothing. She simply leaned closer to the wolf, as if finding comfort in its steady presence. The animal did not move, did not snarl, only held vigil. My mind raced. Maybe the wolf had wandered in to escape a rainstorm. Maybe the cubs I'd been told about had been misidentified. But the footprints, the breath of a child, the uncanny peace between them. It felt like something else entirely. A bond that defied everything I thought I knew about predator and prey. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I should get help, I whispered to myself. But my legs felt like lead. I imagined backing away, closing the door, and calling for reinforcement. Yet some part of me hesitated, entranced by the impossible scene before me. And then, the wolf raised its head. Its ears pivoted forward, capturing the faintest hint of my movement. It studied me, gaze unwavering, as though weighing my intentions. I took an involuntary step back. My mind reeled. Had the wolf protected the girl? Was it guarding her? Or was it simply curious about the lone intruder? I glanced down at the little girl. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on me, a faint flicker of trust dancing in their depths. My own breath came in shallow gasps. I thought, maybe she's too frightened to speak. Maybe she trusts that wolf more than she ever could a stranger like me. It was then that the first sliver of doubt crept in. I thought, perhaps this is exactly what it looks like, a child and a wolf, sharing shelter. But something told me I was grossly underestimating the truth of what I'd stumbled into. "I'm not going to hurt you," I murmured, voice barely audible. The wolf's ears twitched. The girl blinked, and for a heartbeat, I swear her small hand twitched toward the beast's flank. Then she withdrew, hugging her knees tightly. The wolf lowered its head again, as if granting a silent reprieve. I looked around for any signs of other people. Rescuers, photographers, journalists. Nothing. Just the two of them, alone in the decaying house. Part of me still wanted to believe this was an odd coincidence, but deep in my gut, I felt the truth. Nature had conspired to bring these two souls together, and their story was far from ordinary. My heart pounded. I thought, maybe I should call it in now, before something happens. But my feet remained rooted. My flashlight beam wavered as I struggled to steady my hand. I wanted to reach for my radio, to seek backup. Yet another voice inside me urged caution. What if any loud crackle of static would frighten the wolf and the girl? I swallowed again and forced my legs to move forward towards them. The wolf watched with calm acceptance. The girl's eyes flickered with something, recognition, relief. As I closed the distance, the air seemed to hum with tension and wonder in equal measure. I paused just inside the doorway, flashlight trained on the scene. My mind reeled with questions I had no answers to. How long had they been here together? Why had the wolf stayed? What terrible tragedy had befallen this child that she clung to a wild beast instead of people? I exhaled slowly, my pulse finally slowing. I thought, maybe I'm not here to rescue a cub after all. A strange sense of awe washed over me. I wanted to tell the world, but first I needed to understand this miracle. I took another breath, steadied my voice, and prepared to speak again. But before I could, the wolf lifted its muzzle and gave a low, rumbling growl, not of aggression, but of warning, a boundary drawn in the dust. I froze, heart in my throat, and for a moment I believed this was the end, the moment I'd decide whether to run or to stay. And then I thought, I'd seen enough to know this was no mere sheltering in a storm, no accident of fate. This was something far beyond my understanding, something prehistoric, profound, and utterly impossible. I thought the wolf might have just come in to wait out the rain, I whispered to myself, voice trembling. But nature had something entirely different in store for me. When I took that first tentative step backward, my knees nearly buckled. The wolf didn't growl, but it didn't move either. Its golden eyes remained locked on mine, calm yet watchful, as though deciding whether I was friend or foe. Behind me, the little girl pressed herself against its flank, her tiny body trembling, but not with fear of the beast. Instead, she clung to him as though he were her only anchor in a world gone mad. I paused, breath shallow, wedged between the crumbling door frame and a rotting wall. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to slam the door and call for backup. After all, I'd spent 20 years as a forest ranger training wolves, teaching them to obey, to respect boundaries, invade their space, and they'd defend it with lethal force. Yet here, in this decaying house, stood a creature that refused to play by those rules. The wolf's ears flicked, once, then twice, as though registering my hesitation. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable, but in it lay a clear message. Do not touch her. I froze, struck by the realization that I was no longer the one in control. For the first time in my life, I felt subordinate to a wild animal, held captive by its silent authority. I slipped my pack from my back, my fingers fumbling on the straps, and set it gently on the dusty floor. My heart thundered so loudly, I was certain the wolf could hear it. Still, it did not shift a muscle. The child, her dress torn and stained, buried her face in his side. He lowered his head just enough for her to rest against him, whole worlds of meaning passing between them in a single, tender gesture. I remembered a lesson from my early days at the wolf sanctuary. Wolves do not forgive intruders. They circle, they warn, they attack without hesitation. Yet this one had done none of those things. Instead, he stood unwavering in his silent vigil over a tiny human life. I bit my lip, surprised by the swell of awe that rose in my chest. I took a slow, deliberate breath, willing my legs to hold me steady. My mind raced back to the countless times I'd issued commands to packs: sit, stay, come, and they'd obeyed without question. I'd always assumed the bond between wolf and human was one of clear hierarchy, man over beast. But this creature, this solitary guardian, was rewriting every rule I'd ever learned. Tentatively, I lowered myself onto a splintered wooden beam. My knees protested, but I dared not make any sudden movements. The wolf's gaze followed me, unwavering, yet devoid of aggression. The girl peeked around his shoulder, her dark eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I sensed her relief, as if she'd found refuge in his presence and perhaps feared mine. I thought for a heartbeat that all the dread and confusion would melt away if I simply reached out to touch his muzzle. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to prove I meant no harm and the instinct to maintain distance. My stomach knotted. Up close, I could see his fur was matted with grime, and there was a faint scar above his left eye. He was no figment of my imagination. He was real, and he was choosing to protect this child. A sudden crack of wood behind me, perhaps the house settling, sent my heart skittering. I started to push myself up, ready to flee, but then I remembered I was the one who had come here on a rescue mission. I swallowed hard and sank back down. "I'm not going to hurt you," I whispered, voice shaking. The wolf's ears twitched, acknowledging my words without warmth or scorn, just acknowledgement. He had given me this chance. The little girl exhaled softly, wrapping her arms tighter around his neck. I looked into her wide, trusting eyes and felt a pang of guilt. What right did I have to disrupt this bond? Part of me wanted to scoop her into my arms and run, but another stronger part warned me that to separate them would be to unleash some unknown storm. I shifted the pack to my side, fingertips grazing my radio. Rescue teams could be there in minutes. But what then? Would they shoot him? Trap him? I felt a surge of panic at the thought. I clenched my jaw. No, he deserved more than that. He had chosen compassion over instinct. He had defied the very nature of his kind. A wave of emotion washed over me, from fear to respect to wonder. I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary, an alliance born of necessity, nurtured by mutual trust. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. How often had I dismissed such tales as fanciful myths? Now I understood. Nature still held mysteries beyond our grasp. My hand hovered over the pack's zipper. I thought, maybe I can offer food, show goodwill. But as I unlatched it, the metallic click echoed too loudly in the silence. The wolf's head snapped up, alert. The girl stiffened. I froze, heart pounding anew. I thought that was it. My chance to bridge the gap had shattered. But nature had a different surprise in store. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the cold twilight outside, flashlight in hand. The air was so still I could hear my own breath fogging against the beam. My eyes scanned the ground and froze. Paw prints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the soft earth. Each track was clear, 4 toes, a triangular pad, and sprawled in every direction as though the wolf had been on constant patrol. But alongside those prints were long, irregular scrapes, furrows gouged into the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the yard. My heart hammered so fiercely, I almost dropped the flashlight. I sank to my knees and followed the line of scrapes. They led toward a tangle of brambles at the far edge of the clearing. The wolf had dragged something from the house here. My pulse thudded. Was it prey? Was this how he'd lured the child into trusting him? I approached the brambles and forced my beam through the thicket. There, half buried under a layer of crisp, yellow leaves, lay a small, curled shape. I crouched down and recognized the hedgehog before it rustled, a tiny body with spines turned inward, as though frozen in fear. My stomach twisted. This was no casualty of winter's chill. Someone had gently covered the creature with leaves, tucking it in like a child. I swallowed, voice cracking as I whispered to the night, "What did you do to protect her?" The answer came in the pattern of tracks, the scrapes, the prints, the careful leaf blanket. The wolf had carried this tiny hedgehog here, stockpiling food in case they both went hungry. He had scoured the forest floor for morsels, dragging them back to this clearing, not for himself, but for the little girl. My chest tightened. I pictured her shivering in the house, eyes wide and tear-streaked, and the wolf returning time after time with armfuls of provisions, mushrooms, bits of rodents, the occasional twitching rabbit. He'd saved her life with every unspoken sacrifice. I felt a tremor of awe and guilt surge through me. I'd seen acts of mercy before, but never so deliberate, so wholly devoted to another soul's survival. I rose unsteadily and whirled, sweeping the yard with my light. Every pile of leaves, every hollow log, became a testament to his care. I could almost imagine the rhythm of his footsteps, back and forth, his muzzle nudging earthen crumbs into her trembling hand. In that moment, I understood the depths of his devotion. He had chosen to feed her first, to go hungry himself. A tear slipped down my cheek as I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam jittering. My mind reeled. How could an animal, a fierce predator, show more compassion than many humans I'd known? My years as a ranger taught me to respect wildlife, but I never expected this. I thought I understood nature's balance, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. But here was something beyond instinct. Here was a conscious decision to nurture and protect. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but every heartbeat rattled my ribs. I thought of the little girl's hollow look when I first found her, the way her hands trembled as she clutched at the wolf's fur. Now I saw why she trusted him. He had kept her alive, piece by piece, in the shadow of this forgotten homestead. A sudden rustle behind me made me spin around, just a deer slipping between the trees. I exhaled shakily. I fumbled for my radio. "This is Jenkins. I need immediate evac for a child and a wolf. Possible animal attack situation." My finger hovered over the button. I imagined the response: sirens, flashing lights, veterinarians, child services, and then the moment of truth. What would happen to the wolf? Would they tranquilize him, remove him, punish him for a crime he never committed? My pulse thundered as the reality settled in. I thought, I have to get her out now, before it's too late. But as the words formed in my mind, before I pressed the button, a cold dread clutched my heart. I pictured the wolf hearing my voice over the radio, sensing strangers approaching, weapons drawn. A part of me recoiled. Rescuing her might destroy everything he'd built here. I swallowed and let the radio slip from my grasp. My voice shook as I whispered to the night, "He's done enough. Leave him be." But the urgency clawed at me. What if he decided it was enough, that I was an enemy? I told myself I had to act fast, for her sake and his. I made my decision. I would bring her out immediately, take her to safety, hope he would follow me peacefully. My hands trembled as I lifted the radio again. I keyed the mic, ready to call for help. But nature, it seemed, was writing its own script. I thought, this is my chance to save her, to show the world an animal's heart. Then I remembered how tightly she clung to the wolf's side, how the wolf watched me with such solemn trust. I hesitated. My finger hovered. I was sure I'd get her out in time, until I realized the night had other plans. When I leaned forward, arms outstretched, I fully expected the wolf to snarl and lunge. Instead, he rose to his feet with a silent grace, sliding between me and the trembling child as though he were a living barrier of fur and muscle. His eyes, and I'll never forget that look, were neither feral nor fearful, but deeply, unflinchingly deliberate. He was saying, without a sound, "Stay back." My heart jackhammered in my chest. The girl's face crumpled, and she pressed herself tighter against his side, tears spilling down her cheeks in glistening rivulets. She buried her small hands in his matted mane, clinging for comfort. And in that moment I understood with bone-deep clarity, she was not terrified of him, she was terrified of me. I paused, my outstretched arms frozen mid-air. Every rational thought fled as I watched her sob, her once bold eyes now brimming with despair. The wolf held his ground, ears pinned back in warning, yet there was no aggression in his posture, only a steely resolve to protect. I swallowed hard, tasting coppery fear on my tongue. Slowly, as if guided by some unseen hand, I sank down onto the splintered floorboards beside them. My knees hit the dusty wood with a dull thud, and I lowered my hands to my lap. The wolf's gaze flicked to me, then returned to the child, as if granting permission. "Sit. Listen." I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and folded my legs beneath me. I turned to the girl and spoke softly, words tumbling out in a gentle rush. "Hey there, I'm not your enemy." My voice cracked, betraying the tremor in my soul. She peeked through tears, glancing at me, then back at the wolf, as if seeking reassurance. I swallowed again. "Do you like stories?" I asked, and she blinked once, hesitant. So I began. I spun a simple fairy tale about a brave fox cub who journeyed through Silver Forest to save his family from a terrible storm. My words filled the stale air, weaving images of moonlit rivers and whispering trees. With each sentence, the girl's sobs quieted, replaced by ragged breaths. The wolf settled himself, lying down between us like an unwavering sentinel. His vast body curved protectively around her small frame, forming a living wall that neither of us dared to breach. As I spoke of the fox cub's courage, I glanced down at the girl. Her tear-streaked cheeks glistened in the weak beam of my flashlight, and she gently stroked the wolf's shoulder. She stroked the wolf like a teddy bear, I thought, and he endured it as if he knew she was all he had. The truth of it hit me like a blow. These two souls, so different by every measure, had found in each other a bond stronger than fear, stronger than reason. My own fear began to dissolve, replaced by a profound humility. Here I was, a seasoned ranger, trained to command respect, yet I sat in awe of this wild creature's compassion. I paused mid-story and let silence settle among us. The girl's breathing smoothed. The wolf's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. I realized that in their world, kindness could be as fierce and unyielding as any predator's bite. I continued the tale, shifting its end to mirror what I'd witnessed. The fox cub and a human child, united by an impossible friendship, changing the forest itself. With each word, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. I let the story carry me, weaving threads of magic and reality until the brambles outside faded and the crumbling walls disappeared. When I finished, the girl whispered a thank you, her voice soft but clear. The wolf lifted his head, his gaze meeting mine with something like understanding, an acknowledgement that I, too, had been granted entry into their fragile sanctuary. I nodded, tears pricking at my eyelids. I reached out, very slowly, placing my hand gently on the wolf's flank. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into my palm, as though accepting me into his silent truce. My cheek brushed against his fur, and in that touch, I felt an echo of their shared trust. We remained like that for a long moment, the three of us bound by a thread of wonder and mutual acceptance. Then, as if sensing the world beyond the threshold returning, the wolf rose and nudged the girl's shoulder, urging her to stand. She obeyed, her small hand slipping into mine. I rose with her, heart pounding, and together we stepped past the wolf's broad form. He watched us go, unwavering, until we reached the doorway. Then, without a sound, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the ruined house, leaving me holding the child's hand and a truth that would haunt me forever. Sometimes, the fiercest protectors wear fur, and the purest bonds are forged in the wild. When she pushed herself up, I almost reached out to steady her. Her legs were unsteady, but determination shone in her eyes. She took 2 tentative steps toward me, her tiny hand lifting as if to touch my coat. I felt my chest tighten. At last, she trusted me enough to come to my side. But before she could cross the threshold between us, a soft rustle of fur drew my attention behind. The wolf emerged from the shadows like a whisper, padding silently to my back. He paused, head tilted, as if weighing his next move. I froze. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he sank his teeth into the strap of my backpack. My breath caught. He wasn't attacking me, he was trying to open it. He tugged, 2 quick jerks, and I realized what he wanted. I leaned forward and unzipped the compartment. Steam curled from the silver thermos tucked inside. The girl's eyes widened. She looked from me to the wolf, and without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small pastry I'd slipped in earlier. Her little fingers trembled as she offered it first to her guardian. "For you," she seemed to say. The wolf's dark muzzle hovered over the sweet treat, and he took it gently, as one might accept an offering at an altar. His teeth closed around the edge of the pastry, careful not to crush it, and he lifted it to her level. She giggled, a soft, incredulous laugh, and held it out. He sniffed, then devoured it in a single, reverent bite. I felt a sharp tug at my own emotions, envy, awe, something close to reverence. Here was a creature I had always considered wild, untamed, driven by hunger and instinct, and yet here he was, guiding this child's hand, teaching her the ritual of giving and receiving. My eyes stung, and tears blurred the dim light. "Thank you," I choked out to both of them, though I was not sure to whom. The girl looked up, cheeks flushed, and smiled shyly. The wolf's ears flicked backward in a gesture that, to my mind, meant understanding. In that shared glance, I saw the truth. They were a family, not in the usual sense of blood ties or legal bonds, but in a way more profound, a pact of survival and care that transcended species. I raised my phone with trembling hands and snapped a photo. The flash was muted by the dusty air, but it captured the moment. The girl, her arm draped around the wolf's neck, the wolf, patient and proud, and me, standing slightly behind, tears sliding unnoticed down my face. I looked at the image on my screen and felt a wave of disbelief. Had I really just witnessed such an impossible scene? I lowered the phone and sank to my knees beside them. The wolf nudged my shoulder with his snout, as if reassuring me that it was okay, that I belonged here too. The girl leaned in and laid her head against his side. I reached out, placing my hand on the wolf's back. His coarse fur pressed against my palm like ancient bark. I could feel his steady heartbeat beneath my fingers, a rhythm that echoed in my own chest. "Family," I whispered, voice thick. Unbelievable, but real. My eyes filled again, and I let the tears fall. I'd spent my life studying animal behavior, cataloging patterns, predicting outcomes, but none of my training had prepared me for this. A wild creature choosing compassion over instinct, teaching kindness to a frightened child. It was as though nature herself had broken all her own rules just to prove a point. I glanced down at the little girl. She was humming softly, tracing lines on the wolf's flank with her finger. The wolf lay still, every muscle relaxed except for the gentle sway of his tail. They fit together as though carved from the same stone, two disparate shapes forming a single, harmonious sculpture. I reached into my coat pocket for another pastry and offered it to the girl. She looked up at me, a question in her eyes. I nodded, and she passed it to the wolf again, making sure he ate first. Then she took a bite herself, crumb by crumb, as if every morsel was a sacrament. My phone buzzed in my pocket, messages from rescue teams, probably asking for an update. I ignored it. In that moment, nothing mattered but the tableau before me. I would guard their secret, protect their bond, and share the story only when the world was ready to believe. And then I thought of you, listening to this tale. If your heart is racing right now, if you feel that surge of wonder and disbelief, then you understand what I felt in that ruined house. If your heart is racing right now, you know, subscribe to the channel. Nature is wiser than we think. When I pressed the call button on my radio, my voice trembled. This is Jenkins. I need volunteers at the old Miller place. Child in distress, possible animal companion. I stood in the clearing, arms wrapped protectively around the trembling girl. Behind us, dusk settled like a velvet curtain, and every rustle in the trees sounded impossibly loud. Within minutes, headlights sliced through the shadows, engines idled, boots crunched on underbrush, and the volunteers spread out in a cautious semicircle around the dilapidated house. I guided the girl a few paces toward them, her small hand gripping my jacket. But as we moved, the wolf's ears shot upright. He sensed them before I heard a thing. He froze, body taut, gaze fixed on the newcomers. Next to me, the girl stiffened. Her breathing hitched, and she pressed her cheek into my chest, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't fear of the wolf, she looked at him with desperate longing, but fear of the strangers stepping into their fragile world. I felt a pang of guilt. I had brought the cavalry too soon. A volunteer called out softly, "We're here to help," but his words drifted empty into the gloom. The wolf's hackles rose, a shadow of steel and intent. He lowered his head, muscles coiling like springs, then, just as suddenly, bolted toward the nearest window. In one fluid motion, he leapt through the broken frame and disappeared into the forest beyond. The girl gasped and lurched forward, trying to follow him out the window. "Ooh!" she cried, voice cracking with heartbreak. It wasn't a word I recognized, but I understood it perfectly. It was her name for him, their secret syllable. It echoed through the air, raw with grief and accusation. "Ooh!" She broke free of my grasp and ran to the window, hands pressed against the cracked wood. I sprinted after her, but volunteers blocked the way, urging calm. "Don't chase him," I warned, voice urgent. "Let him go." But she didn't hear me. Her eyes were fixed on the dark tree line where the wolf had vanished. Then she froze, body collapsing in slow motion. One moment she was standing, calling his name. The next she sagged to the ground, eyes blank and distant. Her small frame went stiff, a marionette with its strings cut. My heart lurched. Volunteers shouted, but I waded through them. Dropping to my knees beside her, I scooped her into my arms. Her cheek rested against my shoulder, wide eyes unfocused, lips parted in a silent sob. I rocked her gently, whispering, "It's okay. He'll come back. I promise." But my words rang hollow even to my own ears. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, and I let them fall. Volunteers knelt around us, passing blankets, offering water. I thanked them absently, half listening as they conferred in low tones, but my attention was solely on the broken shell of the girl in my arms. She clung to me like driftwood in a storm, as though I were the only solid thing left. My mind raced. What would she think of me now? I had promised safety, but had delivered heartbreak. I rocked her, humming the lullaby I'd whispered to her before, one I'd improvised in that dim room about silver rivers and sheltering trees. The words felt threadbare now, powerless against her despair. A volunteer placed a hand on my shoulder. "He's not gone forever," she said softly. "Wolves have territories. He'll circle back when he knows she's safe." I nodded, trying to believe it, but my chest tightened with dread. How many nights might she wait, calling his name, only to hear the wind answer? I drew a shaky breath. "Let's bring her out of here," I said, voice hoarse. Gently, I lifted her to her feet. She swayed, half dazed, but clung to me, fingers digging into my jacket. Step by step, we moved away from the house, away from the shattered promise of sanctuary. Volunteers formed a protective path as we walked toward the trucks. Flashlights darted across tree trunks, searching for any sign of their guardian. I squinted into the darkness, catching only fleeting glimpses of movement, branches parting, shadows shifting. A small part of me held on to hope that I might glimpse his silhouette one last time, a silent farewell. As we reached the first vehicle, I paused and looked back at the ruined window. The broken glass caught the last glint of daylight, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw two golden eyes watching us, unwavering. But then, the forest swallowed the reflection, and only the hollow doorway remained. I gently set the girl down on a blanket in the back of the truck. She curled into a ball, eyes closed, clutching a scrap of her dress as though it were a lifeline. I sat beside her, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She opened her eyes for a moment, looked at me, then drifted back into silence. I exhaled slowly, fighting the lump in my throat. The volunteers loaded blankets and supplies. Radios crackled with updates, their voices distant echoes in my mind. I leaned my head back against the seat, imagining the wolf's journey through the woods, how he would circle, how he would listen for her call. My heart ached with the weight of their separation, yet somewhere deep inside, I felt a stubborn flicker of certainty. He would return, because nothing in nature, not even the fiercest barrier of human hands, could sever the bond they had forged. As the engines rumbled to life and the convoy pulled away, I looked back at the dark edge of the forest. I whispered into the night, "Wait for her. She'll come back to you." And I realized that this goodbye, this raw, painful parting, was itself another beginning. When the volunteers sifted through the papers I'd found in the cottage, tattered birth certificate, a faded photograph, they pieced together the worst of it. The little girl had been left by her parents almost a month ago. A fierce blizzard had swept through these woods, snuffing out a family's promise of safety, and then the farmhouse had stood empty, save for the howl of the wind through broken windows. I remember the first evening I stumbled upon her and the wolf. I thought the snowdrifts outside had buried every trace of life. I thought the storm had swallowed them both. But as the volunteers traced his paw prints, I realized those prints began long before I arrived. They curled around the porch, threaded through the hallway, and circled the girl's small bed of blankets, frozen now under a thin crust of ice. They showed me the maps they'd drawn, linking each wolf track to a day on the calendar, the 5th of January, the wolf's paws pressed firm in fresh snow, the 20th, a single set of tiny human footprints appearing beside them, the 25th, the girl's prints leading only as far as the cottage door, then stopping. After that, only the wolf's prints continued, looping endlessly until they faded into the woods. My heart sank when I saw that. I realized He had found her on that first night of the blizzard, cold, alone, almost unconscious. His thick coat had brushed against her cheek, and something inside him had stirred. He could have left her. He could have sought food, shelter, his own kind. But instead, he stayed. He circled her, warmed her with his body heat, and hunted the woods for scraps of moss, rodents, even a frozen hedgehog, to bring back as offerings. The volunteers told me how they'd followed the tracks for miles, gathering evidence that the wolf had been her sole guardian. They'd found half-eaten rabbits buried under leaves and small piles of berries laid carefully near her blanket. They had never seen anything like it. They catalogued every find with scientific detachment, but I could see their eyes glisten when they presented the data. I stood there, shivering in my parka, and felt the weight of the story crashing into me. A wild creature, driven by blood and instinct, choosing compassion. A child, abandoned by her own mother and father, saved by teeth and paws. I thought of my own daughter, away at university, and my chest constricted. One of the volunteers stepped forward and pointed to the tracks leading out of the meadow. He followed her scent here every day, she said. He kept watch, making sure she was alive. I ran my gloved fingers over the prints pressed into the damp earth, the ridges still sharp despite the rain the night before. I could almost hear the whisper of his pads against the soil. I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice thick with emotion. He survived with her because he realized she wouldn't survive without him. The words felt too simple, too raw, but they were the only truth I could summon. The volunteers exchanged solemn looks. No one argued. No one offered a different explanation. They knew this was no accident of nature. This was choice. In that moment, I felt a tremor of awe ripple through me. I thought the wolf was simply a beast. I thought the child was merely prey. Instead, I discovered a bond deeper than any I'd known in my years as a ranger. A pact more profound than any oath I'd ever sworn to uphold. I glanced around at the ruins of the homestead, the shattered glass in the window frames, the sagging porch, the empty rooms where echoes of laughter once ringed. The wind carried the memory of her parents' footsteps, fading into silence, and I saw, on the threshold, a new story being written, one of loyalty, sacrifice, and an impossible friendship. My mind raced with questions I could never answer. How had he understood her vulnerability? How had she learned to trust him when she'd been betrayed by her own blood? I felt tears sting my eyes, and I blinked them away, unwilling to break the weight of the revelation with my own weakness. I closed my eyes and inhaled the pine-scented air. I thought the story had reached its end, that I could walk away, tell the world a tidy tale of rescue and redemption. But nature had one more secret to unveil, and I knew that this was only the beginning of a truth so profound that I, even now, struggled to believe. I stood there, alone in the clearing, listening to the wind carry the wolf's distant howl, and I understood, with every fiber of my being, that some miracles are written not in scripture, but in paw prints and tiny footprints pressed into the snow. When the phone rang that morning, I almost didn't answer. 3 months had passed since that night in the crumbling house, and I'd tried to let the memory rest, but the voice on the line was urgent. "Jenkins, we've got a situation at the Miller place." My heart slammed against my ribs. "The wolf's back," she said. "He's sitting on the porch, waiting." I didn't think. I grabbed my coat and raced through the waking woods, the sun a pale smear on the horizon. My old pickup rattled down the narrow track, tires crunching over frost-hardened earth. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I remembered how he'd looked when he first emerged from the trees. Powerful, watchful, and, against all reason, tender. When I pulled up, the volunteers were already there, standing at a respectful distance. The house sat half buried in ivy, windows dark and dust-laced. but on the sagging front porch, there he was, the same broad shoulders, the same amber gaze fixed on the path. He sat like a king waiting for a summons. I climbed out and watched him for a long moment. His coat had grown thick with new growth. He looked well-fed, stronger than before. Yet his posture was unchanged, steady, patient, utterly still. Every instinct in me told me to call him away, to coax him back into the wild where he belonged. But something deeper whispered, "Let him wait." Inside, volunteers had prepared a small nursery room for the girl. She'd spent the past weeks in a children's home, learning to speak again, to trust humans. When I found her that first night, she was mute. Now she chattered in soft bursts, her laughter a fragile melody. I stepped inside and found her already waiting, coat on, face bright with recognition. "Ready?" I asked. She pressed her small hand into mine and nodded, eyes shining. We crossed the clearing together, volunteers falling back in silence. The frost crackled under our boots. With each step, my throat tightened. What if he'd moved on? What if this was a cruel illusion of hope? But as we drew near, he didn't move. He simply lifted his head, ears pivoting to catch our approach. In that moment, I saw it, the faint lift of his muzzle, an almost imperceptible nod. He remembered us. The girl broke free of my hand and skipped forward, boots crunching on the porch boards. She stopped at the top step and stared at him. For a heartbeat, everything held its breath. Then she climbed onto her toes and leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. His eyes softened, and he lowered his head until their foreheads touched. A single, sacred seal. Tears sprang to my eyes. I pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped a photo, but I already knew no image could capture that moment's weight. She whispered something I couldn't hear, and he remained still, as though offering himself up in a final gift. She straightened and looked back at me, eyes bright. I helped her down from the porch. She took my hand and turned to give him one last look. The wolf rose slowly, powerful legs unfolding like ancient oak. He took a single step toward her, as if to follow, and then paused. He flicked his ears once, and I knew this was his farewell. With a gentle breath, he pivoted and slipped off the porch, landing soundlessly on the ground. He turned his head briefly, amber eyes holding both of ours, and then melted into the tree line. I held my breath until he vanished into the shadows of pines and firs, carried away by soft echoes of his departure. The girl collapsed into my arms, tears running free. "He came back," she hiccuped, voice small. "He waited for me." I held her tight, my own tears soaking into her coat. Above us, the wind whispered through the branches like a benediction. Minutes later, we climbed back into the pickup, volunteers following in their vehicles. The sky had brightened to pale gold, and the woods seemed to hum with renewal. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "He gave us the greatest gift," I said softly. "He showed us that love can cross any boundary." She looked at me, eyes still wet but smiling. "I'll never forget him," she said. "He's my friend forever." I nodded, voice catching. "He's ours forever." As we drove away, the ruined house disappeared behind a curtain of saplings and vines. In its place, I carried the echo of a farewell more powerful than any storm, the silent pivot of a wild guardian who gave his heart, then walked away, taking only memories with him. I don't know who he was, a wolf, an angel, a spirit of the forest, but I know this for sure. He saved her, and he saved me. It couldn't have happened, but I saw it with my own eyes. If your heart is filled with awe right now, type, "Nature is wiser than we think."
In the quiet heart of Florida's wilderness, on a sunlit morning in June 2017, something horrifying unfolded. A fully grown white-tailed deer, healthy, graceful, and completely unaware, was caught in the deadly embrace of a 20-foot Burmese python. No one saw it coming. No one was there to help. But what happened after that moment left even seasoned wildlife experts speechless. You think you know how this story ends? You don't. Because sometimes, nature writes a twist you never see coming. And this twist? It wasn't just shocking. It was miraculous. What force interrupted nature's most brutal law, the law of survival? And why did one small act ripple through an entire ecosystem? Hit like, subscribe and let's go. For years, the wetlands near Collier County, Florida, were home to a quiet rhythm. Deer grazed at dawn, herons skimmed the water's edge, and the cicadas hummed their steady lullaby through the dense mangroves. Among the regulars of this wild ballet was a young buck, just over 2 years old. Locals had seen him often, slender, alert, always moving with that mix of grace and caution that only wild things know. He drank from the same muddy stream each morning, following a trail worn soft by years of hooves before his. Nothing ever changed here. The land had a way of staying still, until it didn't. That week, the air felt heavier. The birds were quieter. And deep beneath the underbrush, something had started to move. Something that didn't belong. Something waiting. It started with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that presses against your skin, thick and unnatural. The buck had returned to the stream, like every other morning. But this time, the frogs weren't singing. The herons were gone. Even the wind, usually playful in the trees, was still. His ears twitched. He sniffed the air. Something was off. A faint rustle in the underbrush, too slow for a squirrel, too smooth for wind. He froze, muscles tight, heart pounding. But nothing emerged. Just stillness, and then, the water beside him trembled, just once. Barely noticeable. He backed away. Slowly. Eyes wide. But whatever had stirred beneath the surface, wasn't finished. And deep in the brush, 2 golden eyes opened. Watching. Waiting. This was just the beginning. The next morning, the buck didn't go to the stream. Instead, he lingered at the edge of the glade, ears swiveling at every crackle in the grass. The sun rose slower, or maybe it just felt that way. A strange scent hung in the air, musky, foreign, like wet leather and decay. That rustling sound had returned, only this time, it didn't stop. It moved in wide, deliberate circles, never too close, never too far. As if something was testing him. Watching. A fallen bird, untouched by predators, lay nearby, its body limp, its eyes wide open. He approached, took a cautious sniff, and recoiled. No blood. No bite. Just stillness. The forest around him began to breathe differently, as if holding something in. Something waiting to exhale. He wasn't imagining it anymore. But still, he stayed. Not knowing that with every passing hour, the danger was drawing closer. On the 5th morning, he couldn't ignore it anymore. The pull toward the stream was stronger than fear. Step by step, the buck crept forward, each hoof pressing gently into the soft earth, each breath shallow. The world was hushed, like it knew something he didn't. And then, he saw it. A massive, winding shape, coiled near the edge of the bank, half submerged in mud and shadow. Not a log. Not a root. A python. Motionless, but awake. Its eyes tracked him, unblinking. Nearby, the carcass of a raccoon lay folded in half, like a discarded toy. The buck froze. This wasn't a visitor. It was a predator. A stranger to these woods. Introduced by man, but left to thrive unchecked. And worse, this wasn't its first kill. It was hunting. Deliberate. Silent. And he was next. What was this creature doing here? And how many had already vanished before anyone noticed? It wasn't just one. As the buck cautiously retreated, his path led him to a clearing where the earth had been disturbed, large patches of flattened grass, bones scattered like broken twigs, and the scent, stronger now. He wasn't the first to be hunted. And he wouldn't be the last. Somewhere, a herd had vanished, quietly, cleanly, without a trace. The invader was not alone. Burmese pythons, released years ago by careless owners or hurricane-damaged facilities, had found a home in this fragile ecosystem. And they were multiplying. Unchecked. Invisible. Until it was too late. Panic flickered in his body. His forest, once predictable, had become a trap. He wasn't just running from a predator. He was standing in the middle of a silent invasion. And no one, not even the humans, seemed to notice. Or worse, they didn't care. By dusk, the buck had no more paths to run. The forest closed in behind him, familiar trails now laced with shadows and silent watchers. And then, the strike. Fast. Brutal. The python exploded from beneath the underbrush, jaws unhinged, body a ripple of muscle and instinct. Coils wrapped around the buck's torso before he could leap. The air left his lungs. His legs thrashed wildly, hoofs tearing the earth. No help. No escape. Just pressure, rising, relentless. In that moment, he had to choose, surrender to nature's grip, or fight with every last instinct he had. Eyes wide with terror, body trembling, he braced his neck against the tightening hold. Above them, a hawk circled, screeching once, sharply, as if warning the world below. This was it. The moment that decided everything. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. His legs slowed. The pressure around his chest grew tighter. Bones strained. Vision blurred. The forest faded into a wash of sound, the thump of blood, the whisper of leaves. He was slipping. And the python, cold and patient, tightened with every heartbeat. This was the end. The young buck's body went limp. For a breath. Maybe two. But nature, unpredictable as ever, had one more turn to play. In the distance, sudden crashing. A wild squeal. Then pounding hooves. Not his. Another deer, older, heavier, burst through the trees, charging straight toward the writhing mass. In one desperate slam, it collided with the python, breaking the coil. The younger buck fell to the ground, gasping, battered, but alive. The python recoiled, stunned. And for the first time, it looked vulnerable. The forest hadn't abandoned him. Not yet. The buck stood shakily, legs trembling but heart pounding with something new, not fear, but fury. He had been prey, but not anymore. The python, disoriented, slowly uncoiled, its tongue flickering in confusion. The older deer didn't wait. With one final charge, it drove its antlers into the ground beside the serpent, not to kill, but to send a message. A warning. And the snake, for the first time, backed down. It slithered into the underbrush, wounded in pride more than flesh. The forest exhaled. Birds returned to the canopy. The air moved again. And the younger buck, scarred but breathing, looked toward the trees, where a small herd now stood watching. He wasn't alone anymore. Somehow, he had survived the grip of death. Not because of strength. But because something wilder than the python had stirred that day, unity. Instinct. Hope. Weeks passed. The scars on his body faded, but something deeper remained. The forest felt different now, not just wilder, but wiser. Paths once traveled blindly were now walked with purpose. And every sound, every shadow, was a reminder, survival isn't just instinct, it's connection. The buck stayed close to the herd, no longer alone, no longer unaware. The python? Still out there. And maybe next time, it won't back down. But something changed that day, not just for one deer, but for an entire ecosystem. So now ask yourself, how many silent invasions are happening right now, in places we don't see? And when nature cries out, will we hear it? Or will we only notice when it's almost too late? If this story moved you, hit like, share it with someone who cares, and tell us, what would you have done, if you saw the coils closing in? In the spring of 1984, just outside a quiet town in Iowa, a nearly blind farmer named Walt Hammond spent his last $600 on a dying bull, and everyone thought he'd lost his mind. The animal was skin and bones, coughing blood, barely standing, no vet would touch it, no buyer wanted it. But Walt didn't see a dying beast. He saw something else. Something he couldn't explain. His wife begged him to walk away. His son refused to help. But that day, Walt made a choice that would change the future of his entire family. What happened next would shock the local farming community, and eventually, the entire state. A tale of stubborn faith, silent sacrifice, and a bull that wasn't what it seemed. This is a true story. And by the end, you'll understand why some people still call it a miracle on hooves. Hit like, subscribe, and let's go. Walt Hammond had lived on the same patch of land in Story County, Iowa, since the day he was born. Every morning at 5:15 sharp, he'd lace up his worn boots, pour a half cup of black coffee, and walk the frost-covered fence line before the sun even touched the fields. His hands were thick, weathered, a lifetime of soil and sacrifice in every wrinkle. The barn was old, but it stood proud, like him. His wife, Marlene, ran the kitchen like a general, and their son Cody, 21, was already talking about leaving for Des Moines. Life on the farm was quiet. Predictable. Until one morning in early March, when the old radio crackled with an announcement from a neighboring county livestock auction. A sick bull no one wanted. And for some reason, Walt couldn't stop thinking about it. Something about that voice, that tone. It didn't sound like just another auction. It sounded like a call. That Friday, the wind carried a strange stillness across the plains. Walt drove alone to the auction barn in Boone County, not out of need, but something heavier. He didn't tell Marlene. Didn't ask Cody. Just drove. The auction yard buzzed with the usual bark of bids and the shuffle of boots, but then, silence. A murmur spread as they rolled out lot number 39, the bull. Sickly. Mottled. Its ribs like piano keys under torn skin. It didn't belong there. It didn't belong anywhere. Walt watched as one man laughed and another spat in the dirt. No one raised a hand. Not one. The auctioneer sighed, ready to pull the lot, but Walt stood up. He didn't know why. His hand just moved. Sold. $600. No questions. And as he walked toward the pen, the bull turned its head, and stared. Not wildly. Not weakly. But like it knew him. This wasn't just livestock. This was something else. And Walt felt it. Back on the farm, the bull refused to lie down. 3 nights straight, Walt checked the barn after midnight. Each time, the animal stood motionless, eyes wide open, facing the same corner. No chewing. No groaning. Just watching. Marlene said the thing gave her chills. Cody wouldn't go near it. He's gonna die, Dad, he muttered. You got swindled. Walt wanted to believe that too. But every time he stepped into the stall, the bull turned slowly, and locked eyes again. Like it knew him. Like it remembered him. On the 4th day, Walt noticed something odd. The bull's labored breathing had stopped. No more coughing. No more blood. Instead, strength. Subtle, but growing. The vet he'd called never showed. No one wanted to touch a dying beast. But Walt, he wasn't so sure it was dying anymore. And every night, that same stare, patient, deep, unsettling. Something was shifting. And Walt could feel it crawling beneath his skin. By the seventh day, the bull wasn't just standing, it was pacing. Eating. Gaining weight. Too fast. Walt had seen sick cattle before. Nothing ever reversed like this. One evening, driven by unease he couldn't shake, Walt dug through his shed and pulled out the faded ear tag records from the auction. Lot number 39, no breed listed. No sire, no dam. Just a scratched out line and a faint signature from a vet, in Sioux City. Curious, Walt called the number. No answer. But the next morning, a truck rolled into his driveway. Out stepped a man in government-issued boots, saying he was with the Department of Agriculture. He wasn't smiling. That bull, he said quietly, was part of a study. He wasn't supposed to be sold. Walt's heart thudded in his chest. What study? What kind of bull had he brought onto his land? The man wouldn't answer, just handed Walt a card and said, "Don't let it off your property." Then drove away. Just like that. And now? Walt wasn't sure if he was afraid of losing the bull, or what might happen if he kept it. Walt couldn't sleep. That government man's visit kept echoing in his mind. By morning, he drove 2 hours west to Sioux City, gripping the vet's name written in smudged ink. But when he reached the listed clinic, it was boarded up. Closed since 1981. He asked around. One old rancher finally muttered something strange, "You're talking about that experimental crossbreed? Government pulled funding. Too unpredictable." Walt's stomach sank. Back home, he dug deeper. Found an old farming journal, April issue, 1982. Inside, a short article, "Hybrid Bull Trial in Iowa Fails, One Specimen Unaccounted For." Walt stared at the photo. Same eyes. Same scar on the ear. Same bull. They'd called him Genesis. Bred to resist disease. To adapt. To dominate. Not meant for public auction. And somehow, he'd ended up in Walt's barn. The realization hit like thunder, this wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. And now Walt wasn't just a farmer. He was the keeper of something he didn't understand, and couldn't control. By late April, Genesis had doubled in weight. His coat shone like polished iron, his breath no longer wheezed, it steamed. The neighbors started noticing. Some came to peek. Others whispered. Then, one night, Walt heard tires crunching down the gravel road. Not one truck. 3. No headlights. Men in plain clothes stepped out, slow and quiet. One of them wore the same government boots. "We need to take the bull," he said flatly. "It's not safe." Marlene watched from the porch, clutching her coat. Cody stood behind his father, fists clenched. Walt's jaw locked. Take him. Now. After all this? He'd saved Genesis. Believed in him. And somehow, this animal had saved Walt right back. But now, they wanted to erase it all. No explanation. No papers. Just silence. And Walt knew, if he let that bull go, he'd never see it again. Not alive. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about truth. About purpose. And maybe even, about legacy. That night, Genesis vanished. The gate was cut. Tracks led toward the woods. Walt ran until his lungs burned, screaming the bull's name into the dark like it might answer. But nothing. Just silence and broken wire. The men had taken him, or worse. By morning, Walt stood in the empty stall, fists trembling, chest hollow. Marlene didn't speak. Cody punched the barn wall so hard it bled. "We should have done something," he whispered. And Walt knew, they had. But it wasn't enough. That night, rain fell hard. The kind Iowa hadn't seen in years. The creek overflowed, threatening the cattle pens. And then, hoof prints. Fresh. Deep. Leading back to the barn. Walt grabbed a lantern and stepped outside. And there, through sheets of rain, stood Genesis. Alive. Mud-soaked, bleeding, but standing tall, like he'd fought his way home. Walt fell to his knees. He didn't know how. Or why. But the bull had chosen to return. And with that, something shifted again. Not just in the barn. In Walt. In all of them. Walt didn't call the sheriff. Didn't alert the USDA. Instead, he did what farmers do best, he got to work. With Cody by his side for the first time in months, they built a new pen, reinforced with steel and trust. Marlene, silent but steady, brought warm towels and food. News traveled, fast. A local reporter heard rumors of the miracle bull and showed up with a camera. Walt hesitated, then nodded. "Let the world see him," he said. Within days, the story aired statewide. Experts called it impossible, a terminal bull not only surviving, but thriving. Offers poured in, buyers, researchers, even a university. But Walt turned them all down. "He's not for sale," he said. "He's family." That spring, Genesis sired his first calf, strong, alert, perfect. A new bloodline was born. And with it, a second chance for the Hammond farm. Walt didn't just save a bull. He saved his legacy. And maybe, it saved him right back. Years passed. The Hammond farm didn't just survive, it flourished. Genesis became a legend in Iowa, and his calves carried the strength, and mystery, of their sire. Walt, once just another aging farmer on a fading patch of land, now walked his fields with quiet pride and a deeper calm. Cody stayed. Took over the herd. And Marlene. She started smiling again. But every spring, when the air turned soft and the grass grew wild, Walt would sit by the fence and watch Genesis graze, still strong, still calm. And wonder, why him? Why that bull? Why then? Maybe some things aren't meant to be understood, just believed. So now, let me ask you something. If you were in Walt's boots, would you have raised your hand? Would you have saved that bull? Or would you have walked away, and never known what could have been? Think about it. Leave a comment. Hit like. Subscribe. And don't forget, sometimes, the smallest mercy can change everything.